War is a devastating part of human history, often dragging on longer than anyone could imagine, leaving generations scarred and entire regions transformed. Imagine battles raging on for decades, like the brutal 30-year struggle of the 30 Years' War that decimated Europe, or even for over a century, as with the legendary 100 Years' War between England and France. But what about a war that spanned over 700 years? Today, we're counting down the top 8 longest wars in history. These aren't just ordinary conflicts. They include monumental clashes that reshaped nations, like the Great Northern War and the epic Reconquista that redefined the Iberian Peninsula. Starting things off, at number 8, imagine a war that stretched over 2 decades, reshaped entire nations, and left a lasting impact on Europe, the Great Northern War, which raged from 1700 to 1721. But what made this war so significant, and why did it last so long? Let's dive into the struggle that pitted mighty empires against one another as alliances shifted and heroes rose and fell. Our story begins in the early 1700s, when a young Swedish king named Charles XII found himself the target of a grand alliance. His enemies? A formidable coalition consisting of Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, and the towering Russian Empire, led by Tsar Peter the Great. These nations were tired of Sweden's dominance in the Baltic region and wanted to end its supremacy. The conflict ignited when Sweden was simultaneously attacked on multiple fronts. Yet, against the odds, Charles XII displayed incredible military brilliance. In the early years, he even managed stunning victories, like at the Battle of Narva in 1700, where the Swedes crushed the Russians despite being heavily outnumbered. But as time wore on, the tide began to shift. Peter the Great modernized his forces and learned from his early defeats. Russia's relentless campaigns, coupled with harsh winters and the draining cost of warfare, began to erode Sweden's strength. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, where the once mighty Swedish army was shattered. The war dragged on for years after Poltava, with various twists as new players entered the scene. Ultimately, in 1721, Sweden was forced to sign the Treaty of Nystad, ceding territory to Russia. This marked the end of Sweden's era as a great power and the rise of Russia as a dominant force. Coming up next, at number 7, picture this: Europe in the early 1600s. The continent was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and empires, all vying for control. But the spark that ignited the war came from deep-seated religious tensions. Since the Protestant Reformation, Europe had been divided, Catholic versus Protestant, and the Holy Roman Empire, which encompassed much of Central Europe, was caught right in the middle of this religious tug-of-war. In 1618, the situation exploded in what's known as the Defenestration of Prague. Yes, that's a fancy way of saying some angry Protestants threw 2 Catholic officials out of a window. This act set off a chain reaction of battles and alliances, with different European powers jumping in. The war spiraled from a religious struggle into a political free-for-all. Over 3 decades, the conflict dragged on, turning into a nightmare of shifting alliances. Spain, France, Sweden, Denmark, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire all took sides. Mercenaries roamed the countryside, and entire towns were decimated. The devastation was immense. An estimated 8 million people died, not just from combat, but from famine, disease, and sheer chaos. Finally, in 1648, the war ended with the Peace of Westphalia. It redrew the map of Europe, ended religious wars on a grand scale, and set the stage for modern nation-states. The 30 Years' War didn't just change borders, it reshaped how countries dealt with each other and ended a century of religious bloodshed. Up next, at number 6, the Anglo-French Wars, from 1202 to 1214 and beyond in various campaigns, was a saga of power, betrayal, and an unending thirst for dominance over Western Europe. Our story begins in the early 13th century, when 2 great monarchs clashed, King John of England and King Philip II of France. The stakes? Vast territories in France that were under English control. This wasn't just a fight over land. It was a battle for the very survival and supremacy of 2 powerful kingdoms. King John, often called John Lackland for his misfortunes, faced an uphill battle. After a series of humiliating defeats, Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, captured Normandy in 1204, stripping England of one of its richest territories. But John wasn't ready to back down. He launched campaign after campaign, desperately trying to regain what he had lost. For 34 years, the conflict raged, with knights charging across muddy fields, castles under siege, and alliances formed and shattered. Yet it was more than just fighting. It was a war of endurance, where both nations exhausted resources and faced internal strife. King John's costly failures even led to the creation of the Magna Carta, a momentous step in limiting royal power. The war reached its dramatic climax at the Battle of Bouvines, where Philip II's forces decisively defeated John's allies, crushing England's hopes of reclaiming French lands. This victory solidified cemented France's power and marked a turning point that reshaped European politics for centuries. Up next, at number 5, in the heart of Central America, a brutal conflict unfolded that spanned an astonishing 36 years, the Guatemalan Civil War. Starting in 1960 and only ending in 1996, it became one of the longest civil wars in history. But how did a nation find itself entangled in such a drawn-out nightmare? It all began when a series of military coups and widespread corruption fueled discontent across Guatemala. The conflict ignited as leftist insurgents took up arms against a government fiercely backed by the United States, amidst Cold War fears of communism. What followed was a bloody, high-stakes game that engulfed villages, mountains, and cities. The violence was staggering. More than 200,000 people lost their lives, and countless more disappeared. The country saw entire indigenous communities erased in what's now recognized as acts of genocide, leaving deep scars that are still felt today. The war wasn't just about politics or ideology. It was a grim struggle for survival, where fear, military repression, and guerrilla resistance became a dark rhythm of daily life. After years of international pressure and negotiations, a peace accord was finally signed in 1996. But even decades later, the shadow of the war looms large, and the stories of those 36 years remain a powerful testament to the resilience and pain of a nation seeking peace. Halfway there, at number 4. Did you know that the Greco-Persian Wars lasted a staggering 50 years? These epic conflicts between the mighty Persian Empire and the fiercely independent Greek city-states were among the longest in ancient history. It all began in 499 BCE, when the Ionian Greeks revolted against Persian rule. The Persians, led by King Darius I, sought to crush the resistance and extend their empire deeper into Greece. But the Greeks were no pushovers. From the legendary Battle of Marathon, where the outnumbered Athenians won a shocking victory, to the heroic last stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae, these wars were a masterclass in strategy, courage, and defiance. Even when the Persians returned under King Xerxes with an army so massive it shook the earth, the Greeks didn't bow. Over 5 decades, city-states like Athens and Sparta forged alliances, sometimes even turning on each other, but they always kept one goal: freedom from Persian domination. Up next, at number 3, the Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars, a conflict spanning a staggering 675 years, from 680 to 1355. Across these centuries, the Byzantine Empire and the Bulgarian state clashed in an epic struggle for dominance over the Balkans. But what made this war one of the longest in history? It wasn't just a single war, but a series of brutal campaigns, truces, and betrayals. Imagine this: an entire struggle stretching across the lifetimes of countless emperors and czars, where one generation's victorious became the next forgotten battles. The stakes: survival, land, and legacy. It all began in 680, when the Bulgars defeated the Byzantines, forcing them to recognize a new Bulgarian state. Yet every piece was fragile. From Crum's thunderous victories to Basil the Sec, the Bulgar slayer, each side sought to outmaneuver the other. Centuries of conflict, thousands of lives lost, and empires reshaped. The Byzantine-Bulgarian Wars weren't just about battles, they were a saga of ambition. Next up, at number 2, the 100 Years' War, a conflict so epic it actually lasted 116 years. From 1337 to 1453, England and France clashed in one of the longest and most brutal wars in history. But why? Well, it all started with a Game of Thrones, quite literally. When the King of France died without a clear heir, England's King Edward III claimed the French crown. France didn't take that lightly, and the stage was set for over a century of war. This wasn't just a single battle, but a saga of shifting alliances, legendary heroes, and evolving warfare. Picture this: knights in shining armor gave way to archers with deadly longbows, and castle sieges turned into ruthless gunpowder bombardments. Iconic figures like Joan of Arc emerged, a teenage warrior who inspired the French and changed the course of history before her tragic end. The English had their moments of glory, winning famous battles like Agincourt, but the French eventually pushed back. By the end, France stood victorious, and the medieval world had changed forever. The 100 Years' War drained nations, redefined warfare, and set the stage for the Renaissance. It's a story of ambition, power, and endurance, an epic struggle written across generations. And at last but not least, the Reconquista, a struggle that spanned an incredible 774 years. Starting in 718, this epic conflict unfolded as Christian kingdoms fought to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Islamic rule. The war began when Muslim forces known as the Moors swept into Spain and Portugal, establishing a dominant presence. But resistance was fierce. Christian forces, though initially divided, never gave up. For nearly 8 centuries, battles raged across mountains, cities, and fields. Generations came and went, passing the fight from father to son. Think about it: entire lifetimes spent in the shadow of this conflict. It wasn't just a war, but a centuries-long saga that shaped art, culture, culture, and society on both sides. The Reconquista saw moments of cooperation and coexistence, but also saw brutal fighting. Land was lost, retaken, and lost again. But by the 15th century, Christian forces began to unite. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, delivered the final blow, capturing Granada, the last Muslim stronghold. And just like that, after 774 years, the Reconquista ended, marking a dramatic close to one of the longest and most transformative wars in history. But how did such a prolonged conflict shape the world we know today?